Hello, everybody. A very warm welcome back to those of you that have joined us over the past few weeks, and also a very warm welcome for those of you newly joining us today for our very first ever virtual event experience, The Paradigm Shift. I'm Christy Kaler, and I'm a member of the Strategic Alliances team here at TradeShift. Hopefully you're having a beautiful day, start to your day, or end of your day, depending on where you are across the globe. And today especially, I hope your coffee is topped up or that glass of wine is full, because you're definitely not going to want to miss a minute of today's featured speaker. Just before we get started, I want to quickly call your attention to the screen. So again, we have our extremely talented graphic recorder, Jai, recording the event. Jai joins us from Sketch Effects, and he's been visually summarizing each section as we move through the program. We're also very close to seeing the final canvas with all 5 pieces at the end of the program the next week. So let's move into week 4, the talk. I've personally been very much looking forward to this week since we announced who was going to be joining us today. Before we get started, just a very couple of quick housekeeping notes. Of course, to continue on our mantra here at TradeShift, shift happens. So if there are any tech glitches, please sit tight and we'll be right back. Also, we really hope this session will be fully interactive, so we welcome you to ask questions, give feedback, and make comments at any time. The discussion is extremely relevant, and our speaker is one of the leaders of organizational change, so please join in that discussion and conversation. And I've talked too long, so let's begin. I have the extreme pleasure of welcoming and introducing you to Aaron Dignan. Aaron is the best-selling author of Brave New Work and founder of The Ready, which is a global organizational transformation coaching practice. He's helped many companies, large and small, adopt forms of self-organization and dynamic teaming. And he's also worked with companies such as Microsoft, Citibank, Airbnb, you may know those names, and sat on advisory boards for GE, Amex, and PepsiCo. His work couldn't be more timely now, given the need for adaptability and the time to embrace the future of work. And if you haven't checked out his podcast yet, please do so. It's a great listen. Thanks so much for joining us today, Aaron. Without further ado, the stage is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Hey, everyone. I am really excited to be here and share a little bit about what we've been noticing in the world and what's coming. So I'm going to quickly share my screen and we'll jump right in. Brave New Work is a book I released last year, and it was the culmination of about a decade of work where I was asking the question, what's stopping us from doing the best work of our lives? Why is it that when you meet people, most are not satisfied with the role they're playing at work, with the meaningfulness of the work, with the soulfulness of the work, with how adaptive and responsive and reflexive work can be? And so I went on a bit of a walkabout, and I want to show you what I've learned along the way. I start every speech that I give off with a picture of an org chart, and I ask what year it's from, which in a crowd of people in a non-COVID world is quite a fun, raucous event. But here, if you're in the chat, by all means, take a guess. What year do you think this org chart is from? And we'll see where folks are at. 1935, not bad. Fiona, love it. 1986, that's strong, Martin. I find that the range of answers I get is roughly 100 to 200 years when I put up a sufficiently fuzzy org chart. And the reason for that is that these things have not changed. They haven't changed much at all. This particular org chart is from 1910. It's one of the earliest boxes and lines org charts of the Southern Pacific Railroad system in the United States. Railroads, of course, were some of the first businesses that were so far flung geographically that they needed to start to think about, who the heck worked there. And so these charts became critical. A few of my favorite things about this one are that it already has dotted lines on it, and it's one of the first of its kind. So we were in trouble in terms of, accountability and alignment from the get-go. What is wild about org charts to me is that had I shown you a picture of almost anything else, a house, a phone, a dress, a car, a shoe, you could carbon date it better than this. This is the instrument by which we visualize all of human effort in for-profit, nonprofit, government, you name it. And we have no idea where it's rooted in time, which means one of two things is true. Either it's perfect, exactly the way it is, and we can all go back to work, or there's just something really intractable about it. We can't think beyond it, we can't see beyond it, and we're not sure why. So that's the question that I want to start with. The second thing that I'd like to sort of quiz you with a little bit are these ways of working. So these are 5 ways of being at work. And I want you to reflect on them as I go and think, have I ever seen this at work anywhere, at my current workplace or a prior workplace? Have I ever done this stuff myself? And what does that mean? So insisting on doing everything through channels, through the right, proper channels at work, never permitting shortcuts to be taken to expedite decisions, referring matters to committees, making those committees as large as possible, haggling over the wording of communications. So when you think about, the internal org change announcements, when you think about things that are going out to the market, how much of that kind of precision around wording are we fighting for? Referring back to matters that were decided upon at the last meeting and relitigating those decisions. And then finally, my personal favorite as someone that works with a lot of large organizations, multiplying the procedures and clearances involved in issuing instructions and paying checks and all these other activities. See that 3 people have to approve everything where 1 would do. So by virtual show of hands, have you seen this behavior in yourself and others at work, right? And I find the numbers pretty staggering. I would say, I've done this in, 15 or 16 countries now. 90%, 95% of us are like, hands up, we're seeing this or we're doing this. And that is truly profound, because the source of these ideas is not my research. It's not companies that are alive and well today. The source of these ways of working is a guide from the precursor to the CIA in the midst of World War II on how to sabotage a company. They actually had people that were sympathetic to the Allies inside enemy state who were willing to do things inside business out there to drag the economy to a halt, to try to damage and injure the economic health of the enemy. And so they wrote a guide on how to do that. And these word for word items, and there are many more, there's about 15 or 16 ideas in here, came directly from that guide. And so what is wild about that is that in the space of a single human lifetime, we've gone from this being obvious sabotage behavior to this being like kind of normal bureaucracy at most workplaces that are older than 5 years and bigger than a few hundred people. And so we've lost the plot a little bit on how to work and a way of working that really serves us. And it's affecting our experience, right? It's affecting our experience at work. So most people at work are struggling. Roughly 1 in 2 are unhappy in their current job. Roughly 1 in 2 are thinking about quitting. 1 in 2 are not engaged, which means they're kind of working for the weekend. They're not really celebrating their work as meaningful and connected to their own purpose in the world. And 1 in 5 or 6 are actively disengaged. So they effectively are trying to sabotage their colleagues or the company in order to get ahead. And so you have this really, really challenging soup here, where if you imagine this as a dinner party instead of a workforce, half the people coming to your party don't like you, and 1 in 5 or 6 kind of really hates you, and that's your dinner party. And so there's work to be done here. And for those of us that care less about the human experience, but really just care about, it's business, damn it, and is it working? There are indicators that it's not working, right? So yes, you can look at the stock market, which as of today, in the midst of all the things that are going on in our world, is clearly woefully irrational and disconnected from reality. Or you can look at some other metrics. And so looking at things like average company lifespan, return on assets, they're all going down into the right over the last many decades. They're all going from a place of relative stability to instability and to inefficiency. How is it that I have a device in my pocket that's more powerful than the computers that took us to the moon that I can use on Wi-Fi when I'm 30,000 feet in the air or in bed, and yet my return on assets is 1/3 of what my grandfather's was? What the hell is that, right? What's going on? So there's a big question mark here about productivity growth stalling, about lifespan stalling, about all the kind of resistance to long-term success and effectiveness. And it's funny because when you ask economists or academics why this is, you get a range of answers. It's sort of like asking a doctor why there's more children with food allergies today. We're not really sure. We can point to a bunch of stuff. Maybe it's the pesticides, maybe it's the GM, we don't know, right? And so same thing happens with this. You ask folks why productivity growth is stalling, and people are like, oh, well, we're not inventing things as interesting as the locomotive, right? They're just not really sure. But when you ask people at the edge, when you ask people that work a cash register, wait a table, code software, answer a phone, they'll tell you exactly what it is in harmony, and they all say the same thing. What is holding us back from doing our best work? What's holding us back from being efficient? Is bureaucracy. It's the red tape that we've wrapped around the handle so that we're no longer able to do things with our own human judgment and respond and act and move quickly and get things done and serve the customer, or even know who the customer is for that matter. And this is a huge gap. And if you think about the moment we're in right now, where we're in kind of this post-COVID hitting us remote work moment, think about how hard it was for all of our systems to adapt to this moment. It was wildly disruptive. We're talking about tens of millions of people out of work. They're out of work not just because we all had to stay home. They're out of work because their businesses were unable to reimagine how they worked or how they get things done in a sustainable way in a limited time frame. It was a failure of adaptivity. And the ones that already had really high levels of adaptivity and low level bureaucracy tended to navigate fairly well. Now, obviously, there are some structural disadvantages. There are some companies that work in industries that we're not allowed to operate, things like that. Of course, that's all well and good. But I'm talking about the middle of the bell curve here, like the folks that had a chance and just haven't managed or navigated it well. And bureaucracy is one of those words that we throw around a lot to, blame things that we don't like on. We don't really understand what it means. Technically, it means rule by desk. Bureau is French for desk, and cracy is Greek for power or rule. So it means to be ruled by desks, which is an interesting way of putting it. But I use a different term. I like to use the term organizational debt. And for those of you that are, working in finance or fans of finance, probably understand financial debt very well. You borrow money, you have to pay interest on that money, and that hurts. If you work in software and technology, you understand technical debt. So you cut corners early on, or you just make decisions early on to ship software, and later on you have problems with interoperability and scalability and extensibility, and so you have to refactor or edit that software to make it work. So that's tech debt, and the frustration there is the refactoring. Org debt is the same thing, but just writ large. All the policies and procedures and processes and assumptions and rules and roles and structures inside the organization that are no longer serving us, that maybe they served us once, but they're not serving us well today, that we have not refactored, that we have not reconsidered, that we have not edited. My favorite example of this is the story of the glove. There's a brass auto parts manufacturer in Europe where a new CEO was asked to turn the company around, and he was wandering the factory floor, and he came upon a man with a slip of paper by a supply cage who had been standing there for a while, and asked the man, "Hey, what are you doing?" And the guy said, "Well, I'm a machinist here, and I am trying to get some new gloves because my gloves have worn out." And the CEO said, "Oh, well, that's interesting. How does that work?" And the man said, "Well, when your gloves wear out, you have to show them to the manager to prove that they're worn out enough to justify new gloves. And when you've done that, they give you a slip of paper and you shut down your machine and you walk across campus to this supply area that's under lock and key and manned 24/7. And you turn in your slip and you wait, they get your size and you get your gloves and go back to work." And the CEO was thinking, kind of quizzical about that. And he's like, "Well, that's interesting. How much do the gloves cost us?" And he turned to the finance folks that were probably wandering around behind him and said, "How much do the gloves cost us?" "Well, the gloves cost us €5, let's say." "Okay, interesting. And how much does it cost us to shut down this man's machine for half an hour while he goes through this whole process, this whole apparatus?" And they were like, "Well, back of the napkin, let's just say it's several €1,000 for the half an hour." And so the CEO said, "Well, I'm no mathematician, but it sounds like every pair of gloves we give out is costing us €3,005. And everybody, kind of dumbfounded, was like, "Well, yeah, I guess that's true." Perfect example of org debt, right? Because it came from a very natural place, right? The leader, the manager, the floor manager noticed that a box of gloves had been stolen and thought, my job is to ensure perfection and execution and certainty and safety and reliability on the shop floor. And so I'm not going to stand for this. We're going to make sure this never happens again. And the way they make sure it never happens again is that they create this apparatus, all these, policies and procedures and rules around how this is going to work, all to prevent the gloves from being stolen. But in the process creates all these externalities, right? All the costs that's associated with the downtime and the waste. And much more importantly, and I think undervalued, is the externality of what is the cost of treating 800 Frenchmen like they're children for 10 years? What does that do to productivity? What does that do to engagement? What does that do to attrition? And the answer is nothing good. That's why the place needed a turnaround. And these are signals. These are signals about our assumptions about people, right? The assumption is we can't trust you to get your own gloves because you're a thief, a liar, and a cheat, and you're just trying to get out of work. And so that's how we're going to treat you. And guess what? The way you treat people is not that too dissimilar from how they behave. So org debt is a real issue. Now, one of the things that's wild about org debt is how much it costs us. So some buddies of ours in the space, Gary Hamill and Michel Zanini, have done the modeling on this, and basically they figured out that if you just look at unnecessary layers and unnecessary compliance activity, you get about $3 trillion a year in waste in the US and about $9 trillion of waste a year globally. So let's just say that's a big dollar figure, right? That's 12 zeros of waste because we can't refactor our org debt. We can't think through or think beyond these issues. Now, the reason we can't think beyond them is because we misunderstand these two words. So this is something that really became clear to me in the research is that, and even in honestly transformations that we've worked in and around, misunderstanding these two words is the issue that leads to a lot of the suffering in the world of work. We think of them as synonyms, right? Complicated, complex, they're both words for things that have many parts that we don't understand that frustrate us. That's kind of how the general layperson or general business person might think of these two words. However, they're very distinct words when you talk to a systems theorist, someone who studies systems and how they work. And so you would ask, all right, well, what's the difference between the two? And they'd say, oh, well, they're very different. And if you treat one like the other, you'll be very disappointed in the results that you get. So I thought for our little adventure today, we could do a master's degree in systems theory around these two ideas in 30 seconds. So we'll just do it very quickly and get your fingers on the keyboard because we're going to try to use chat again if you're around. So here we go. So let's see, complicated versus complex. Let's vote. So starting with a watch, who thinks a watch is complicated? Who thinks a watch is complex? Just throw your thoughts in the chat. I think it's complicated. I think it's complex. Yeah, what most groups do is they kind of split the difference. About a third of people say complicated, a third of people say complex, a third of people, conscientiously object and don't vote. Let's do the engine. Complicated or complex to the engine. All right, let's raise the stakes. We've got weather. Complicated or complex for weather. What do you think? Is it complicated? Is it complex? Usually there's a little bit more alignment here. We start to coalesce around an idea. What about traffic? Traffic, complicated or complex? All right, interesting. Yeah. So what we usually get is a little bit of a mix. We get some action on both sides. Some people in the room probably know. Most of us don't. So let's go back and figure this out. So these two systems both are complicated systems. They're complicated in the sense that they are causal systems. There's a cause and effect connection inside the system. They are complicated, so they're not simple. There's a lot of parts. I have no idea how either of these things really works. If it breaks, I can't fix it. But someone who is trained can. So if you're a mechanic, if you're a watchmaker, you can reliably fix a problem in one of these systems. And that's one of the things about complicated systems is that they're unlikely to surprise us if we have experience in that area. And they are very likely to have problems that can be solved. So that's sort of the nature of the complicated system. If you then turn to these two systems, and I would add to this list gardens and 7-year-olds, these are complex systems. Complex systems are what they call dispositional. So they have a disposition, an attitude, a way they're trending, but we can't be sure exactly how they will end up. We can't be exactly sure what will happen next. So it looks like rain today is a disposition. Exactly how many inches and where down to the square inch, well, that's really impossible to say. The traffic can look bad on the 405. Adding 6 more cars can ruin it for the night, or they can just be kind of soaked up and nothing really changes. There aren't computers that can model this because there's a chaos at the heart of these systems because so many different individual agents are interacting that anything is possible, right? So things are going to evolve in ways that surprise us. These systems are very likely to surprise us. And as a result, a problem in a complex system cannot be solved. It can only be managed, right? It can't be solved, it can only be managed. Nobody ever comes in from the garden and says, honey, I fixed the garden, it's done. It's not how gardens work. Nobody ever picks up their kid from school and hears, hey, I fixed your kid. That's not how human beings work. So it is unusual then to think about how we talk about our own organizations. So walking away from these ideas of complicated and complex and asking the question, what do these concepts mean for our organizations, is a really interesting one. And what I think it means is that we're going to be dealing with both, and we're going to have to learn how to delineate and discuss and characterize and react to both kinds of systems, in addition to other kinds of systems that exist, in order to be successful. So, for example, if we are writing software, the coding of the software itself is a fairly complicated activity. It's knowable, it's trainable, there are some best practices, it can be tested. There's sort of, if there's a bug in the system, you can fix it and make the software work the way you intend it to work. Making software people want to use, or getting them to use it the way you intended, is a complex activity, right? That's never going to work out the way you think, and there's no way to fix that. You're going to have to be in constant relationship with that system. Same thing goes for building an airplane, right? The spec of a 787 Dreamliner is incredibly complicated, like 2 million parts complicated. But boarding that airplane when it's completed is complex. That's why they never get boarding right. Boarding can never be perfectly fixed because it's a human activity with 200 participants. So there's going to be an inherent mess involved in that. And with these systems, what we're doing then is managing. That means testing and learning, probing, sensing, and responding, finding ways to understand the nature of the system by interacting with it rather than trying to control it. And so what's funny about that is when you see how many systems go out and say, oh, well, here are our new company values on posters and coffee mugs all around the world. Why aren't our people changing their behavior now? And it's like, well, a checklist, an advertisement for a new way of being is not really how a complex system changes. You can't fix the values of your people. You can play with it. You can nurture some behavior and try to starve other behavior. You can play games with the system, but you can't just decide and decree that we're going to be different, right? And so that's the punchline, is that culture, way of working, way of being, these things are complex, and they're going to require a complex approach, right? To manage the complexity, both inside the firm and also outside the firm in the world at large, which, by the way, as we're all noticing, in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of an incredibly powerful uprising about police brutality and race right now, at least in the US and somewhat globally, the complexity outside is massive, right? We cannot see around corners. Anything is possible. And so we need a different operating system for that. And that's amplified when you're working remotely, right? Because now not only are we dealing with that complexity, but we don't have all the benefits of being in the moment, serendipity, body language, connection, being human beings in the same space. We now have to manage this from our homes, with our children having school in our homes, right? So there's a lot going on here that is challenging, and it requires a new OS. And the OS is just another name for the fundamental assumptions, principles, and practices and beliefs that are going on inside our system, right? So if you look at these two ideas, most organizations, whether they're startups or what I call end-ups, are on one end of this polarity, right? The startups are in chaos. They're unconstrained. They have no constraints, no rules, no boundaries, no limitations. They don't really know how they do what they do. And their job is to figure that out. So as they figure it out, they start to iron out process and procedure and roles and structure. And then they end up in an environment where suddenly it's a bureaucracy. And the large scale enterprises are sitting there in bureaucracy looking back at startup land and saying, hey, I'd love to have that flexibility and that agility, but I can't, because I have 100,000 people and we're in 46 countries, and there's no way that we would be coherent as an enterprise if we just had no constraints. And the startups are looking at the bureaucracy saying, gosh, I know I have to scale and figure this out, but I don't want to become that. And both think they're stuck. But in fact, there's a third option, there's a third way, which is a different way of thinking about constraints. So Chaos is a no constraints environment, right? That means no boundaries. Bureaucracy is a governing constraints environment. By governing, I mean bright red rules, right? Like bright lines that, that you can't cross this line. It must be done this way specifically. And then the third way is about enabling constraints. And an enabling constraint is like a simple rule, a heuristic, a unit of judgment that can help you kind of have freedom within the framework of an idea. So, having somebody who has the freedom to figure out a way to do something, but within the space of some principles and some guidelines and some constraints. And actually, it's not that any one of these things is bad. A healthy business will probably have a mix of all three, but the right mix, right? What's the mix that actually leads to what we want to do? So my favorite example of operating systems in action, of constraints in action, is an intersection. So here we have two roads crossing. Our goal, of course, is to get as many cars through as we can without causing accidents. And so on the left, we have the lighted intersection solution, the signal controlled intersection. And on the right, we have the roundabout. So they're two very different operating systems with different assumptions about people and the problem. So as we think about this, what are the assumptions about people and the problem on the left in the lighted intersection? And maybe if you have an idea, just throw it in the chat for others to see what do we assume about people and the problem in the lighted intersection? So yeah, usually right out of the gate, we get someone that says they'll follow the rules, which is good. And actually, I think in both cases, in both operating systems, we're assuming some measure of compliance with the rules. Obviously, when that doesn't happen, we have accidents, we have problems. On the left, in the lighted intersection, I think the biggest assumption is that people need to be told what to do. They come to the intersection, we better tell them, right? So if it's time to stop, we'll tell them to stop with a red light. If it's time to go, we'll tell them to go with a green light. We will control this intersection for the people in it, right? And the way we do that is with a big apparatus. So we're back to the gloves a little bit. We've got lights, we've got poles, we've got wires, we've got power, we've got lines on the ground, we've got a control center in the background there that runs the algorithm for the whole grid so that all the lights on different streets change at the right times. We've got a lot of apparatus here to support this. And by the way, it works pretty well. I mean, I've been driving for a long time, and I've been in precious few accidents that are the fault of the light system. On the right, we have a different set of assumptions about people and the problem, right? So the assumptions here are more like they'll figure it out. They'll figure it out, right? We'll let them kind of navigate the system on their own terms. And it's not without constraints, right? So the other one was almost all governing constraints. This one has one governing constraint, which is go with the flow of traffic. So everybody goes in the same direction. If we didn't do that, it would be really pandemonium. But there is an enabling constraint as well, which is give right of way to the people in the circle. Well, how much right of way, right? Do I wait till the circle's empty to white knuckle it and go in? Do I pull right in front of someone with 6 inches of space? Do we treat this like 2 lanes or one? Can I go around as many times as I want before I exit? There's a lot of flexibility about how I do this. Do I do it fast or slow? But I certainly am not waiting for any powers that be in order to get through this intersection. I'm simply waiting for a moment when my judgment deems it safe to proceed, right? I'm using my judgment to make that decision. And so we ask the question, well, if these two operating systems are existing in the world, which one has higher throughput, more cars per hour? Which one is safer? Which one is cheaper to build and maintain? And finally, and most importantly, which one works better when the power goes out? And the answer to all 4 of those questions is the roundabout, in some cases by astronomical numbers, right? Like it's 95% safer on fatality collisions, for example. So what's interesting about that is it just performs better based on a much different set of constraints, right? And I'm not here to tell you that we should have every intersection be a roundabout. That would be insane. There are plenty of places and contexts where a roundabout makes sense, and there are plenty of places where it doesn't. If all of downtown Manhattan was roundabouts, there'd be no room for the buildings, right? There are places where this doesn't make sense. But there are 1,153 times more lights in the US than there are roundabouts. And I really don't believe that there are 1,000 times more cases where that makes sense. I think what it is a comfort with a way of being, with a way of being told, with a way of interacting that allows us to check out. And if you show these two systems to people and you talk about this, the most common thing I hear is, hey, I know I'm safer in the roundabout statistically, but I feel less safe because everybody's crazy. And it feels like a scenario where there's a lot of chaos, and I don't like the way it feels to be in the roundabout. I don't like to navigate it. We're not good at it. And that to me is a very interesting take, because I do agree. I think the roundabout asks more of us. It actually allows us to use our judgment, and that means we have to be present in the problem. The light lets us check out of the problem. So when the light's red, I'm on my phone, I'm talking to my friend, I'm doing something else. But in the roundabout, there's no space for that. And so we achieve a higher level of performance, but we do it with a different level of activism, right? It is literally a socially coordinated solution. So we can look at these two things as different ends of a polarity, right? So we can say, all right, we have on the right, trust and autonomy, on the left, control and compliance. Neither one is inherently good or bad, but the mix of the two and where we fall in this continuum with any given practice or policy is a critical choice. And it's a choice we should make for ourselves. We should not just inherit from the generations that came before us that invented their way of working on a factory floor. So if we're talking about our travel policy, if we're talking about how we punch in and punch out, if we're talking about how we get paid, if we're talking about how we do budgeting, I don't want to be all the way on the left or all the way on the right just because someone said so. I want to be where we are on the spectrum because we chose it deliberately because it serves us best. And so that is the idea of choosing your operating system. And these ideas here, these spaces, are the bulk of the organizational operating system. So these are spaces where when we look at people that are working differently, thinking differently, achieving things that seem unlikely with higher levels of autonomy and transparency and decentralization and freedom at work, these are the places where they're doing things differently and where they're innovating. And so these are the mirrors we have to look in and ask ourselves, what do we do and what do we think? What do we believe about strategy and how it should be done and its role in the business? And then what do we do? What do we believe about authority and what do we do? And are those things aligned? And more often than not, we say they are, but they're not. So we say, oh, we're an empowerment culture here. You got to believe it. Very interested in empowerment. But then when you ask people in the elevator, is this an empowering place? They're like, no. What are you talking about? Because we're not really being honest with ourselves about what's going on. And I think the remote work movement of the last few months has been a perfect example of a challenge to these assumptions, right? A lot of people were talking about how empowered and fluid and dynamic they were. And then suddenly it was like, oh, you're not going to be able to stand over the shoulder of every employee that works for you. And managers were freaking out. Like, we're never going to get anything done. Of course, what is fascinating is we have all gotten things done. And most companies that were able to go remote are actually more productive now than they were before the pandemic, but we'll leave that for another time. Okay, so this is the operating system we have to stare at and think about. And we manage our operating system at the Ready with agreements. So we take each of these areas and we make agreements about how we work. We make those agreements with the consent of the people involved, either direct consent or elected consent. And we write these agreements in a public, transparent, editable format. And so that way, if anybody's wondering, like, well, how do we deal with tools in our clients? Well, there's a draft agreement being written there. How do we set our pay as members of this system? Well, there's a proposal for that. How do we manage free cash flow, right? There are answers coming through the system in the form of proposals, written agreements that we live with all the time. Here's an example. This is the autonomy agreement at the Ready. It's one of our foundational agreements, which basically says, you're all adults, be adults, work within the bounds of our agreements, serve the purpose of the company, and we're not going to treat you like children. That's basically the idea. One of my most fascinating things about culture to me right now is that we would literally lay down in the sand and fight to protect a democracy that doesn't have a king, where we have a vote and an elected government and where we have a say. And then we go to work and we happily participate in a dictatorship. Super weird to me, very intellectually inconsistent. And so the idea here is, no, we're going to operate in the same way. We're going to be intellectually consistent. You make life or death decisions at home for your family. We trust you to make, $500 decisions here for us, right? So that is the nature of this agreement. Now, there are three companies that I brought today to just very quickly highlight to show how far these ideas can go. The first is Morningstar. This is a tomato processor. It's the world's largest, based in California. And for over 2 decades, they've been running a self-organized system where every employee in the company writes their own job description and sets their own salary annually. And they do this with an elaborate advice process that allows them to feed back to each other and support each other in the work, with a very high transparency about their financial success and what other people are doing and what competitors are doing and what everyone's paid in the system and what's needed. And it's delivered remarkable results. I mean, this is a company that, you know, has 10x the average profit over the last 20 years of its competition, because they are able to, you know, do more with less, and they're able to do that through a system of, you know, trust and advice. So it's kind of a neat case. You can read hundreds of pages about them, or any of the cases I'll show you if you're interested. It's a quick Google search to say Morningstar tomatoes self-organizing and see what comes up. The next case is actually the USS Santa Fe. We had Captain David Marquette on the show recently on the podcast to talk about this. But essentially what happened here was he was preparing for another sub. He was handed this sub at the last minute to command it. It was the worst performing ship in the fleet, and he had to turn it around without firing anyone. And the way that that happened was shifting from a command-driven approach to an intent-driven approach. So intent-based meant when someone came to him looking for orders, instead of giving them an order, or even giving them a bad order because he didn't understand the ship as well as he, you know, had hoped to, he said, well, what do you intend to do? And they would say, well, I intend to, well, actually, I don't know. Maybe I didn't have an intent, or I intend to, you know, dock and refuel and do this training exercise, what have you. And he would say, very well, right? So everybody started to realize we're accountable for our own intent. We're accountable for knowing what we think needs to be done. And then over time, they also added a lot of work around competence models. What does good look like for the ship? Around transparency, so that there was a flow of information on the ship. And it went, you know, in a few years' time, it went from worst to first. It became the top performing ship in the fleet with the same crew that had been, you know, the F-rated crew before. And it produced, I believe, more officers than any other ship in naval history during that tenure. So it's kind of a neat case of this stuff working in a very high risk environment. Often people's pushback to me when I start to talk about ideas of autonomy and humanity and let's work differently is, yeah, but if we make mistakes, people die. And it's nice to refer them to David and say, well, how do you feel about being, you know, 1,000 meters under the water in a nuclear propelled machine carrying nuclear weapons? How does that sound for risk? Because if it works there, maybe it can work for you in making paint or what have you. So yeah, so that's a neat one. And then finally for today, the case of Haier. So this is a Chinese appliance manufacturer, and they have done some really radical stuff over the last few years, blowing up a traditional functionalized organization and turning it into a networked marketplace of micro enterprises. So they took a company of 60,000 people in these big functions like marketing and design and development and customer service, and they blew it up into 2,000 autonomous teams, each with their own P&L, each with their own freedom to pursue their customer and do what they needed to do as they saw fit. And it became this dynamic market rather than just one big monolithic company or set of functions. And it's worked remarkably well. They each team elects their own leaders. People can move freely between teams. New teams can be started in partnership with venture capital outside of the firm, and sort of launched within. And it's turned Haier into the fastest growing appliance manufacturer in history. They acquired GE appliances and did the same thing there. Produced profit and revenue growth for the first time in a decade within 12 months. There's really interesting stuff going on, and it has not been without its disruptions. It's been challenging, but it has been very effective, and I think a nice model for what does this look like at scale. So that's one to look at as well. All right, so these are the two ideas we've been talking about all morning, or all evening, depending on where you are. It's morning for me. People positive, what do we believe about people? And complexity conscious, what do we believe about the world? This is really all it is. There's a lot of different certifications you can get out there to use lots of different words and ideas to explain agile and lean and teal and new ways of working. But for me, it's what do you believe about people? And what do you believe about the way the world works? And if you fundamentally believe people are worthy of trust and respect, and you fundamentally believe in the fact that there are different contexts out there and we need to bring the right tools to the occasion, then I think you're set up for success. And those are really the ingredients of the kind of adaptivity and health that we're looking for in organizations. So at this point, and we're now rounding towards home, at this point people usually say, hey, that sounds great. I'll buy the t-shirt. I love it. Let's change, except for just one thing. Change doesn't work. Organizational change doesn't work. It's kind of a mess. And so this has been cute, but we can't go any further. And I sort of agree with those people. I mean, 70 to 80% of change management efforts fail to deliver the change they seek. Only 6% of change is felt by people on the front lines. So that's the same odds as blackjack, which I think is kind of funny. Every time you do org change, you're basically playing blackjack to see if the people that work for you are going to feel it. And there's a reason for that. The reason for that is very simple. We think about change this way. We think about it as this process that happens to us, this grief process that hurts and is painful and we have to like climb out of, and we're 5% better off than we were when we started. And by the way, when you hear employees being change fatigued or resistant to change, this is why. Why would I want to go through all that terrible stuff to be 5% better than I was before? It just doesn't make sense. And if you can afford a really, really, expensive consulting firm, really blue chip, then it looks like this, which is effectively the same thing, but now you get a bridge, an eagle, eagles, and flags, and all this. But in the end, it's the same idea. It's basically saying, like, we're going to go through this horrible thing, and then things are going to be great. And what both of these misunderstand, that you now understand from your master's degree in systems theory, is that change doesn't work this way because systems don't work this way. We're not all in the discover phase. We're not all in the visualize phase. We're not all in need of the same changes. We're a vibrant ecology of teams in different places and regions and cultures who have different issues and tensions, who are trying to discover new ways of working that serve us in our context. And some of those things will be global, yes, but a lot of those things will be local. We want that vibrancy. It's not like you can treat your whole garden the same way. Nobody goes out to fix the garden with a set of 5 values or a set of changes that we're going to make to every plant. We all need water, sunlight, and some fertilizer, yes, but other than that, it's different treatment for different things. And so that's what we need to do, is change how we change from something that's very top down, very once in a while, to what I call continuous participatory change. It means continuous, that we're not going to do a big org chart re-announcement every 3 years and move everybody around and then pretend that that's going to work. Because 6 months later, we realize we were wrong. And a year later, we realize we really need to change. But we're so committed to what we just did that we're going to wait until we have a new leader or another 2 years pass before we finally get frustrated enough to do it again. Instead, let's change the rules and the roles a little bit all the time with micro adjustments to our working agreements. And in terms of participatory, let's do that together. Every team at every level, whether you're a pyramid or a peach, should be able to live in this loop. The loop is, what's holding us back from doing our best work? That's the tension. What alternative practices could we consider from either inside or outside the firm? That's the practice. And what's the safe to try, safe to fail experiment that's going to allow us to move forward? Something that we can do a radical thing at a non-radical scale. How do we do a radical thing at a non-radical scale so that we learn something powerful? Either it didn't work, and that's okay because it didn't kill us, or it did work, and the implications now are huge. And that's really what we're going for, is this continual looping learning process inside every team that will, over time, adapt and change and morph the system. And it'll shift all of those spaces. It'll shift how we think about authority. It'll shift how we think about information flow. It'll shift our structure. It'll shift all the things that matter in the direction of our purpose. So that is the very simple, but very hard to do well, process of change that we actually see working inside systems around the world. Now I'll finish before we maybe have time for just a few questions with one final little anecdote. This is how the high jump was done for many, many years. And for the gentlemen who are watching, you can see how very precarious this was. This is for a very good reason. The reason is that the other side of the pole for a very long time was just the dirt that you jumped off of in the first place. And so if you fell on anything other than your feet, you were going to be injured, right? Because you're taking a 6 or 7 foot fall. So they had to create ways to do the jump where they could actually land on their feet. This is the straddle technique. There was like a Western scissor, a Western roll. There were all kinds of different moves that people did. And they all landed on their feet one way or another. In the mid 60s or so, new synthetics and foams came on the scene, the rules changed, and suddenly there was a pad on the other side of the pole, and new things were possible. And a young man named Dick Fosbury started doing this at his high school track meets, and then went to the University of Oregon, where his coaches begged him to stop because that is not how we do the high jump. And so he stopped for a while, and he was so bad at doing it the regular way that they invited him to keep doing it his way so they could win track meets. And he did, and shortly thereafter, while he was still in school, he went to the 1968 Olympics, won the gold medal, and broke the Olympic world record for high jump, jumping over headfirst and backwards. And most people tell this story to tell the story of innovation and thinking different and run the Apple logo and all that. That's not what I find interesting about this story at all. I think what is interesting about this story is how the other competitors reacted to Dick's success, to his win. And what they did is they said, hey, works for Dick, won't work for us. It's incredible for this guy. Look at what he can do, but he's different than us because we are fill in the blank. Taller, shorter, from a different culture, we train differently, our muscle fibers are different. There are a million excuses, but it works for Dick, it won't work for us. And when I give this talk and I do this work around the world, that is the number one pushback I get to is, hey, this is all great. Works for them, won't work for us. Because, hey, it's wonderful that Handelsbanken can operate without a traditional budget as a $20 billion bank and have 40 years of success. But their regulators are different than our regulators, so we can't do it. It's great that Google can do that, but we're not a software company. Oh, it's great that Morningstar can do that, but our people, we could never trust them to set their own salaries, right? There's always an excuse for why not us. And here's the thing, because I try so hard to be complexity conscious, I have to say, well, they might be right. It may be that some of these ideas can't apply in a certain situation. I have to be open to that. And importantly, they have to be open too, that until they try, they won't know. There's no way to know in a complex system until you probe it, until you try something, until you test and learn. And so if there's any inkling of a suspicion that the way we work might not be the be-all, end-all, it might not be the best way for human flourishing, for human development, for our communities, for our economies, then we owe it to ourselves to start the experiment, to start trying, to start questioning the assumptions of the many practices that have been handed down to us. Because I got to tell you, the thing they do not teach in business school is that this was all made up. It's all imaginary. Everything we do, the budgeting process, the planning process, the strategy process, the way we hire and fire, we made it up. Somebody made it up, and they made it up in the last 100 years in most cases, right? We made it up recently, and we made it up in environments where we were trying to make a box of cornflakes taste the same over and over again. We are now in a world of remote work, of globalism, of rampant inequality, of rapid technology development, of markets that demand creativity and breakthroughs. We are not making cornflakes most of the time. And so it's incumbent on us to reinvent. And I thank you for your time and attention. And I will now turn it over to see if there are any questions. Oh, Christy, you're on mute.
Thank you. We do have a couple of questions here in the chat. So the first one, how do you reduce redundancy in the hire model? Quite often in that model, multiple teams, are trying the same problems and reinventing the wheel. Collaboration takes a backseat.
Yeah, totally. I love that. So I think the first question here is, how much redundancy is good redundancy? So the attitude of the kind of extractive, perfect efficiency approach that a lot of firms tend to try to take for the market is not really aligned with complexity. So we know that we don't want no diversity. We know that we don't want no redundancy because we see in the most adaptive systems that there is some. There is some duplication of effort, there is some randomness, there is some resources that are held back and slack in the system, and all those things serve to help us when we have to navigate a novel thing that happens, right? So one of my favorite examples is, you put a bunch of ants in a room where there's an apple in the middle of the room, they will find the apple, of course, and 80% of the ants will converge on the apple, but some percentage of the ants will never go for it. No matter, even though they hit the same pheromone signals, they will continue to randomly roam the room. Why? Well, number one, the apple might be poison. So if it is, now the whole colony is dead. So that's one reason. Number two, there may be a strawberry, right? So we can look for that. So there's a lot of these kinds of, forked paths approaches. Redundancy specifically, though, I like to look at it from the perspective of how much we know. So when certainty is high, when we have a reliable sort of point of view about what's needed and how it's going to work, I think redundancy is wasteful. When certainty is very low and we're in a new place, a new market, then redundancy is very helpful because we'll figure out the right way faster if we have parallel experiments going on. The way that systems like that tend to manage that is that they have moments in their operating rhythm where they are sharing up, down, left, and right what they're working on, and then having a moment of reflection and sense making to figure out, should two teams combine? Should one team blow apart into two pieces? Are there things that are redundant that are not serving us because there is certainty? Are there other kinds of redundancy we want to see? So there has to be a moment for that visibility, and that's very systems dependent. So teams that do this well at scale have really good visibility systems and really good like work in public policies about everything being out in the open of what we're developing and working on, at least within the scope of the firm. And that helps to minimize that. But at the end of the day, when you talk to a CEO about something like that, they're going to say, that is in one of these types of systems, they're going to say, you know, I'll accept a certain amount of waste for the level of innovation I'm getting, for the level of breakthrough I'm getting, I'll accept that. But if it gets too much, then we're going to have to, you know, tweak on those systems that allow us to see and to sense what's going on.
Excellent, thanks. Another one here. What's the single biggest mistake you see when organizations try to change?
I think a few things. Yeah, I'm not sure if there's a single biggest, but probably the most common failure pattern is we can't make time for this. So we get really excited about it. We get really motivated. We make the announcement. And then when it comes time for the retrospective, or it comes time for the governance meeting where we approve experiments, or it comes time to draft something, or you know, whatever it is that takes our energy away from the execution in the moment, it's, you know, the hands are thrown up and, oh, we can't really do that. We can't make time for that because it's a busy week. We're having a really busy week, so we can't make time for learning, or we can't make time for what have you. And that is, it's kind of it's a self-defeating choice, because we're minimizing our ability to get better at expense for, you know, at the expense of executing. So my favorite comic in the world of work is a picture of some people pushing a square-wheeled cart uphill, and there's someone standing next to them offering them a round wheel, and they're like, yeah, we got no time for that. We got to get this thing up the hill, and it's taken forever. And that is what we're doing to ourselves all the time when we don't sharpen our saw, when we don't reconsider how we're working and take the moment. So that's one thing. I would say the second fail state I see a lot is trying to do too much too fast. You know, you can't move into this way of working with a mandate from the top that is just supposed to happen because you said so. It's an organic thing. One of my favorite thinkers in this space, Niels Flegging, talks about like changes like milk in coffee. Like you drop it in and it just kind of moves and spreads. I like that metaphor a lot, and I think that's what we're looking for here, is like, what can you drop into the system? What can you remove from the system that starts to let the milk flow and let things happen? And so instead of trying to do it all in one big pronouncement, letting it unfold over time and being patient with it, being committed to the idea 100%, but not committed to the speed of the implementation, I think is really important.
Excellent. And actually one that just came in kind of to build on that, since change is scary for management and colleagues, how do you present that in a positive way and not focus on the negative?
Yeah, well, the best way to do that is with invitation. So one of our key precepts around change that we employ right away is we don't tell anybody to do anything. So we're not going into a system saying you're going to do this and we're rolling it out and we're the consultants here to help and, you know, get in line, get on the bus or get out. That kind of change does not work. So instead we go in and we say, hey, some of us are thinking about changing how we work to be more adaptive and more human. If that's interesting to you, we're meeting on Friday all day. And they come and we have an experience together and we sample some of that, and we try some of that, and we talk about it and we make space for it. And at the end of the day, we say, hey, if any of you enjoyed this, we're going to start allowing teams to experiment with these ideas across the canvas, and we have the support of the CEO to do that. So just raise your hand if you want your team to do that. And now, 50% of the people in the room raise their hand for that. And then we go do the work with them. And what happens is when you work with them, their lives change, their service changes, the way they interact with the system changes, and people can tell, and they start to ask, and they start to be curious, and they start to say, I'll have what she's having. And that's the pattern that we're actually looking for. So we don't get people okay with change. We ask them what they want to change. And we actually ask them the question, what's stopping you from doing the best work of your life as a team? And if the team can agree on something, then we start there. And so we might think that their number one problem is the way they make decisions or meetings or, bad information or what have you. But if they think their number one problem is they don't have equal talk time, let's start there. See where that leads. Because we can only fill the space in our heads for the questions we already have. We cannot fill space in our heads when we haven't even asked the question yet. So me yelling at somebody they need to change their budgeting process is a waste of my time. But when they finally get to the question, I don't even have to do any work because they've got the hole they have to fill now. And the human mind is incredibly voracious and curious when we're sitting with a question that we know we want to answer. So my job is basically inviting better questions.
Excellent. Well, I'll invite one more question from the group here just before we wrap. How do you effectively build a unified company culture when everyone is working remote and rarely interacting face to face?
So interesting. Yeah. So what's challenging about this is that the peacetime answer to this question is those systems find moments to be together. The healthiest remote cultures I know of still have moments throughout the year that they try to bring groups together because we are human beings and we are still made of stuff, and we can't get away from that. So I think that's challenging. However, I think the easiest thing to do is not try to do too many things in one forum, but try to do the things that build culture and connection deliberately in your operating rhythm. So instead of trying to have a meeting that is both about making decisions and about figuring things out and about having fun and about building connection, that's gonna be a terrible meeting. Don't do that. Instead, be like, all right, we have moments in our rhythm and we're sparing with them. We're not trying to put everybody in 8 hours of Zoom a day, right? There's a moment in our rhythm where we are doing governance. There's a moment in our rhythm where we are doing sense making. There's a moment in our rhythm where we're just playing. Like most of the companies that I really respect in the remote space have like legit serious game nights where they are just coming together, having a drink, playing a game in little pockets on Zoom and having a blast and just being human beings together. Some of them bring their kids to different meetings. They have like a storybook hour with kids. Some of them have music hour where they're making music together. Like they find ways to be human together and they separate those from the work so that both can be really high octane. And I think that's the best advice I have in this moment is like, decide what you need, what's missing in terms of that connection and that purpose, design a forum for it and take it seriously.
I think that's so important. I mean, as a company trade shift, with us having so many teams that have remote members to find those opportunities to be human are truly, truly important. More now than ever. Yeah. Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for joining us today. I mean, personally, I particularly love the analogy of the glove and that impact on engagement, productivity, and attrition. And then also the need for trust and autonomy. I know I'm looking forward to wearing the t-shirt and truly supporting that, continuous participatory change. We really need that to kind of start, especially as you mentioned with, globalism and the rampant inequality that we're seeing now. So look forward to digging into your book and I hope we get to have you join us once again.
Oh yeah, it'd be fun. Thanks so much.
Excellent. So we are nearing the end of the program. Just as we close off, a note on our final week. So I can promise you all, you really won't want to miss the finale that we have next week, which is the happy hour. As with all great trade shift events here, everybody knows we work hard and we play hard, and it certainly isn't a business event without a few drinks to wrap, even virtually. So if we can't be physically together, we are going to bring happy hour to you. As you'll see there, we were going to start next week with a learn your own bartender session. We're going to have the incredibly talented master mixologist from Liquid Chefs, Callum, join us. And then our CEO, Christian Lang, will be raising a glass for an open line and an interactive Q&A session. So to prep everybody for that session next week, we do have a list of ingredients here on the screen, but we are going to be sending that out post-session today as well as prior to next week. So you can pick up those few things to make one or all of those cocktail or mocktails that you enjoy. And also, we just want to encourage everyone as well to continue the conversation as we have in past weeks. I know a lot of the content today, certainly looking to continue that. As well as sending us your questions next week for Christian sessions. So #ParadigmShift is where you could do that. And again, just a very last thank you for joining us all today. I hope you have a wonderful week. I hope your families stay safe and we look forward to seeing you next week. Cocktail shakers and questions in hand. Bye for now. Take care.